my screen. Oops. So let me just a second. Let me see. Okay, great. Mhm. Okay. So, well, thank you so much for the invitation first. I mean, it's always great to, in these difficult times with no opportunities for socialization, any opportunity to socialize like this one is always very, very welcome. So today I'm going to talk about vagus nerve stimulation, of course, and our recent research on that, but I will also discuss part of the work during part of my postdoctoral work with Bharat Chandrasekharan's team at the University of Pittsburgh. And okay, so let me see if I can. Okay, so let's start with this, right? So we know that the human brain is during the first months of life, right? The brain experiences rapid and fundamental adaptive changes that are happening are multiple levels. And if you're curious about the different types of synaptic changes, you can read this review by Knudsen, right? And this explosion of plasticity is often referred as the sensitive period because the brain is much more plastic than later. And in some cases, these differences in plasticity across the lifespan are really big, to the point that this sensitive period is often referred as also a critical period. And this sensitive period definitely is not something that is exclusive to humans and has been investigated in multiple species. And one of those species, for example, are songbirds. So if you look at a white crown sparrow during the first months of life, his brain is experiencing multiple changes, right, to create a template of the song that later in life will practice, like a few months later during the sensory motor period. And then after practice, the bird will crystallize this melody. And after this melody has been crystallized, right, it's really difficult for this bird to change, right, to change and acquire new melodies. So in this case, we have a sensitive period that is at the same time a critical period. But this is not exclusive. This is not the same in all birds. So for example, we have other birds, like for example, canaries, which seem to have much more flexibility in terms of plasticity. So they actually are able to learn more and different melodies across the lifespans. And for some people, there is ethologists that are working on neuroethologists that are working on these with these models. They actually consider that they might have like a different sensitive periods or longer definitely sensitive period than the sparrows, right? So humans, so for some skills, this really depends on the cognitive skills, right? But I think we could say that for some skills, we behave more like canaries, and we are very flexible, and we have a lot of plasticity across the lifespan. But in some specific cases, right, we are more similar to sparrows. And I would say that in the sense that, it's becoming really difficult to rewire our brain in the same way that we are rewiring our brain during the first months of life, right? And speech is definitely one of those situations, right? And so you can find people like is, for example, my case, right? Immigrants that after 10, 20 years, we still have an accent, right? We still are not changing the way we speak. But that, as we know, is not happening for all skills, right? So one of the goals of my research is I'm not only trying to understand the effects of first and second language experiences on a speech processing, but I'm also trying to find ways to enhance neuroplasticity in adults, right? And today I'm going to talk about two specific techniques that I investigate during when I was doing my postdoc with Bharat Chandrasekharan at University of Pittsburgh, right? So the first one is very well-known technique, I would say, is using a high variability laboratory training combined with trial by trial feedback. And what we are trying to do in here is to well, you know, the trial by trial feedback stimulates the dopaminergic system, which is involved in reward. And we also know that this system can be used to enhance the representation of speech sounds in the superior temporal gyrus, which is, as you know, one of the brain areas that are involved in the development of second language speech categories, right? And this was very nicely shown in this study by Ganji Fen. He was another postdoc in the lab, and he showed how after using trial by trial feedback, there was this dopaminergic driven enhancement of the new speech categories that were being developed here in the more anterior area of the superior temporal gyrus, right? And the other, I think this is really interesting because we know that, for example, infants don't need explicit feedback to shape their senses, but it seems like in adults, using these techniques, like using a trial by trial feedback, could be very helpful, right? And perhaps because, you know, there is kind of like a sensitive period and the amount of plasticity is reduced with respect to infants, especially plasticity induced by passive exposure. So the other technique that I will discuss is peripheral nerve stimulation. This technique is often referred as vagus nerve stimulation. There are multiple modalities. I will discuss one particular non-invasive modality, which is called transcutaneous vagus nerve stimulation. And the goal of this technique is to try to stimulate the noradrenergic system, which is the system that is involved in the production and regulation of norepinephrine. And this neurotransmitter seems to be a strong modulator of arousal or alertness. And, you know, there is some research showing that by increasing the level of arousal and alertness, you can actually enhance memory and perception. So these are the two techniques that I'm going to discuss today. And when we are working on, speech processing and second language speech acquisition, right? One of the very first things that we need to say is like the neural processing of speech sounds doesn't start in the cortex, right? Of course, we have different cortical areas that are playing a super important role in the processing of native and non-native speech sounds, like the auditory cortex. More recently, if you look at more recent research in electrocorticography, you will see also the superior temporal gyrus, which is involved in the processing of spectrotemporal properties. There is some fMRI research showing the importance of the superior temporal sulcus for phonological processing. But before we get here, the auditory signal is traveling through multiple subcortical areas in the ascending auditory pathways. And there is a lot of processing in here that is also crucial to perceive sounds in the way we do. More specifically here, we have the neural coding of extremely important properties like timbre or pitch, right? So you know, looking at only at cortical processing is going to provide us an incomplete picture, right? If we want to look at the complete picture, get a general picture of what is going on, we also need to look at subcortical processing. And that's one of the things that I've been also doing during my postdoctoral work. And there is actually a really interesting signal, really useful signal to look at the processing in these areas. This is an non-invasive electrophysiological signal that is called the frequency following response. And this signal can be collected with a very simple setting of 3 electrodes. So you basically can place 1 electrode here on the vertex. It's one of the things that I really like about this signal is the vertical montage is really easy. And then you can also use the 2 other electrodes, you can place them in the mastoid, one as a reference, and the other electrode in the other mastoid as the ground. There are different montages, and we can talk about that, but the most important thing of this signal is that you can actually, with this signal, you can collect the activity from few layers in the auditory cortex, but importantly, you can get a lot of activity from areas below the cortex here in the ascending auditory pathways, like inferior colliculus or medial geniculate body, that are telling you a lot about the processing of speech properties, the neural coding of speech properties. So a really interesting property that makes this signal special, especially if you compare this signal with other classic ERPs like mismatch negativity, is the neural mechanism that is driving this signal. And this signal is reflecting a neural activity, or phase locking activity in neural ensembles within the auditory system. So for example, for those who are not familiar with what phase locking activity is, you can look at this sound in here, and this is just a waveform, and you can look at all these oscillations, and if you look at these oscillations, you can see that the signal has really these slow oscillations in here that I'm coloring in red, but it also has these fast oscillations here in black, right? And these fast oscillations are really important because they are involved in the encoding of all these speech properties that are super important for speech perception, right? All these acoustic properties like timbre of pitch, right? So they are responsible for, they are helping us to perceive sounds in the way that we are doing, right? And so if you look at here, what I'm showing here at the bottom is just a frequency following response. And if you look at the frequency following response, you will see that the oscillations in the neural response are phase locking, are locked in phase, kind of like synchronizing time with fast oscillations in the speech signal. So in some sense, what the frequency following response is doing is providing a neural representation, right, of these important oscillations that are encoding timbre and pitch. And this representation is providing a neural representation of these oscillations with a high degree of fidelity, to the point that we can actually play the neural signal, the FFR, and hear something that is super similar to the original sound, right? So this is what I'm showing here. So in this video, what you will see is you will see a sound that is going to be different melodies, and then the screen will become blue, and then what you will hear will be actually the neural signal. So it's the neural signal that will be played. Okay, so let's try. Can you hear? No? Huh. Okay. Can anyone hear? No, right? Okay.
I think if you go to, sorry to interrupt, but if you go to your screen sharing options, there should be an option to share computer sound. Yeah.
Yeah, I clicked on that option before. Yeah. So yeah, let me try again. Okay. Can you hear the sounds? Okay. I'm gonna try again without the sharing option, and if it doesn't work, I will move to the next slide so I can, so we don't spend too much time here. Let me see, share screen. Okay. Okay. I don't know if it was really easy to hear, but basically, you know, the neural sound, the neural waveform sound like pretty similar to the original one, right? So so this signal FFR has a very important clinical applications, and it has also applications for language. So one of the most important applications, or more interesting applications for me, is the fact that the FFR is reflecting the effects of language experience. So for example, this has been mostly investigated with the neural coding of Mandarin tones. For those of you that are not familiar with the Mandarin tones or lexical tones, I just want to I just include this slide. So here you have the spectrograms of 4 Mandarin tones, and what these spectrograms are showing is here you want to pay special attention to the fundamental frequency, which is one of the most important perceptual cues. And here I'm showing the fundamental frequency over time. So here in the x-axis you have time, in the y-axis you have these different tones. So you can see, like, for example, the first tone, which is the high level tone, pitch is going like this. And if you pronounce the Mandarin tone, the first the Mandarin syllable ma with this tone, it will sound something like this.
Ma,
Can you hear? Okay. And it means mother. But if you pronounce the same syllable with a second Mandarin tone, with a low rising tone, it will sound like this,
ma,
right? And then it means hemp. If you rather pronounce the same syllable with the low dipping tone, it's going to sound like this,
ma,
right? And it means horse. But if you pronounce it with the high falling tone, it's going to sound like this,
ma,
right? And here the same syllable means scold, right? So you can change meaning, right, just by modulating the fundamental frequency of the sound. And if you actually look at the spectrogram of the frequency following response recorded from a native speaker of English, like in here, or a native speaker of Chinese, like in here, and a non-native speaker of Chinese, like a native speaker of English, which is what I'm showing in here, and you compare these spectrograms with the original sound, you will see that, yeah, both spectrograms are reflecting most of the acoustic properties of the original signal, but the one from the native speaker is reflecting those properties with a higher degree of fidelity. And this is partially because when you have experience, right, phase locking synchronization is improving. And if you have less experience, the phase locking and synchronization is less accurate. So that is what is creating this noise in here. So that's one of the reasons why I've been using the FFR to investigate the neural processing of first and L1 and L2 speech, and this signal is extremely useful for that. And one of the problems of this signal is perhaps the most important problem is, like, it has a very low signal to noise ratio, and that's because most of the neural sources of this signal are coming from brain areas that are really deep in the brain, right? They are subcortical brain areas. So one of the things that is typically done to compensate for that is to record the frequency following responses to thousands of repetitions of the same sound, and then we average across those repetitions to improve the SNR. And you know, this obviously has some limitations, right? But that's what is typically done. And so being able to appreciate differences induced by experiences like here, you might have to actually play the same sound like 3,000 times. And actually, that's what I did in here. This is like so to compensate for these problems, in a previous study that we published in the Journal of Neuroscience Methods, we decided to use a machine learning approach. So what we did is we train a machine learning model to decode frequency following to decode Mandarin tones from frequency following responses to those tones. And here the frequency following responses were averaged across a very few repetitions, right? And we decided to use the performance of the classifier, like the proportion of correct responses, as a metric to try to predict differences between natives and non-native listeners, right? And by using this approach, we were able to identify differences between native speakers of Chinese and non-native speakers of Chinese with as few as 100 repetitions, which is like a 3% of some of the standard averaging sizes that you could find in the literature. But one of the things that I would like to emphasize here, so you can see, like, the classifier was much better at decoding tones from FFRs from native speakers, right? And much worse than at decoding FFRs from non-native speakers. But one of the things that I would like to emphasize in this figure is the fact that, you know, this is, as far as these signals are, you know, capturing a lot of activity from subcortical areas within the ascending auditory pathways. What this is telling us is that, you know, the cortex is not the only brain structure that is changing with experience, right? With language experience, right? There is also a lot of plasticity in different subcortical structures, although the degree of plasticity we know might not be as high as the degree of plasticity in the cortex, but they are still very sensitive to language experience, right? And so this was one of the studies that we published in 2017, right? So one of the questions that we had after this study was actually, so if non-native speakers are showing a worse neural coding of Mandarin tones than native speakers, we wonder if there is any way to improve this processing, right? If there is any way to improve this processing, and that was that was something that we tried to investigate in this paper that we got published in the following year, here this study was led by two former colleagues, Rachel and Silong, and my major contribution to this study was coming from the computational modeling of neural signals. And in this study, so we know that we can use feedback to enhance the cortical representation of non-native speech categories, right? But we know that the cortex is more plastic than these other subcortical structures that are encoding timbre and pitch in the ascending auditory pathways. So one of the questions that we had is, can we actually use this feedback-driven paradigm to improve the sensory representation of those sounds, of non-native speech sounds, right? And so the sounds that we were using here were Mandarin tones. So we were training native speakers of English to see if we were able to improve the subcortical or sensory representation of these Mandarin tones. And one of the reasons why we tried to do that was because actually Silong, in a previous experiment, he trained native speakers of English to identify Mandarin tones, and he was looking at the frequency following responses, and he found that the sensory encoding behavior improved, but the sensory encoding of Mandarin tones didn't improve too much with only 2 sessions of training. So, we were thinking whether this is just because there is a critical period and it doesn't matter how much training they receive, they won't achieve a native-like sensory encoding of Mandarin tones, or it's just that they need more training, or they need more specific training with high variability of stimuli and feedback. So that was another reason why we decided to go with this study. And here I just wanted to show you an example of the task that we used. So basically, they were listening to a sound.
笛、
鲁、骂、
So this is just 4 trials, but as you can see, they were listening to one sound at a time. Then they were, pressing a keyboard to categorize the sound, and then we give them feedback, right, to let them know whether they were correct or incorrect. As I said, this is just 4 trials, but actually the one single session of training was a total of 240 trials. And we train them, we use a long-term auditory training paradigm. So we train them across multiple days. Here you have the number of days for each participant on the x-axis. And here on the y-axis, you have the percentage of accuracy, which is the proportion of responses that were correct. And sorry, someone is asking, what do you mean by more enhanced cortical speech representations? Yeah, so I will get back to that during the Q&A session, but basically the short answer is that when, we have a DTI study that was actually connecting through white matter tracks, investigating the connections between the emergence of tone category representations in learners in the superior temporal gyrus and dopaminergic system driven by the basal ganglia, and we observed that there was a strong correlation between the dopaminergic system and the robustness of those representations in the auditory cortex, as reflected by different metrics such as representational similarity analysis. I can also provide a reference of that paper just in case you want to go into more detail. Okay, so here in the, so basically we were training participants across multiple days, and participants were through multiple stages of learning. So novice was right before training, experience was when they achieve at least 90 or higher than 90% of accuracy for 3 consecutive sessions. The overtrain session was after 10 extra sessions after the experience stage. And then they come back to the lab 8 weeks later for a retention session, right? And at each of these stages, we were collecting frequency following responses to evaluate the sensory representation of Mandarin tones, right? And when I'm saying sensory representation, I mean representation as captured by the frequency following response, meaning that here we are talking about early auditory processing that is going on before the superior temporal gyrus. I mean, and here we might include few layers within the auditory cortex, like layer 4 and layer 3, but it's definitely early auditory processing. And so as you can see here in this figure, you can see like important behavioral improvements over time. It takes a while, obviously, it takes a few days, right? But you can see like all of the participants were improving over time their behavior to, so one of the, just by looking at these improvements, one of the questions that came to us is like, okay, are the neural representations improving as much as behavior? And if they are improving, when are they improving, right? So to answer this question, we use something that is called a confusion matrix. So here I'm showing the behavioral confusion matrix for one participant in the novice phase, right before the training, and what this matrix is showing. So here, for example, in this being, you will have the proportion of times that they were listening to the first Mandarin tone and they respond that the response was correct, was the first Mandarin tone. This will be the number of times, the proportion of times that they were listening to the second Mandarin tone, and they categorize that stimuli as the second Mandarin tone. So here they were correct again. But here, for example, this is showing the proportion of times that they were listening to the first tone, and they categorize the first tone as a different tone. So they were not correct, right? And so the confusion matrix is useful because it's providing the patterns of categorization responses when they were correct, but also when they were not correct. So what we did is basically, here you have a different behavioral confusion matrix for the retention phase at the end of training, and you can see how things are improving, right? Because the beans in the diagonal that are telling you when they were correct are improving, right? Are getting more red, which means a higher proportion of correct responses. So what we did is to look at the frequency following responses at each state, and we just used the classifier, the machine learning classifier that I described below, to try to distinguish tones from their FFRs, from their frequency following responses, right? And we ran the classifier, and we got the performance of the classifier, and we got a confusion matrix for the classifier, and this confusion matrix was telling us how, patterns of confusion between neural responses to tones, right? And what we did is to investigate the correlation between neural confusion patterns and behavioral confusion patterns across different learning stages. And this is basically what we got. We observed like during training, the neural representations of the tones were capturing many aspects that we observe in the perceptual representations, right? Especially some of the relative differences. And this is telling us that those differences are, the degree of similarity between neural and perceptual domains is increasing during training. This is not telling us how good the neural representations are getting. So to investigate how good the neural representations are getting, we actually were looking at different classic metrics, FFR metrics, that are telling us how good the signal is getting at each training session. And one of the things that we observe is that, you know, it took a while. It took like the overtrain session, but for the overtrain session and retention session, we actually observed that the neural representation of these Mandarin tones was native-like, didn't differ significantly for the neural representation of native speakers, right? So I think we got very excited about this result because, as I said before, these responses generate in part by subcortical brain regions that are not as plastic as the cortex. So if we are able to, you know, change plasticity at the subcortical level in adults, that's extremely promising, right? That means that, you know, changing plasticity, for example, in cortical areas should be easier or should take a less amount of training. So this is one of the techniques that I wanted to talk today, but the other technique that I mentioned in the first slide, and this is one of the techniques that I was also using with my colleagues from University of Pittsburgh to try to improve category learning, was peripheral nerve stimulation. And you know, you will find a lot of detail about what I'm going to tell in the next slide in this paper that got published last year. And here, what we try to do is to try to use this peripheral nerve stimulation to enhance the acquisition of Mandarin tones in non-native speakers of Mandarin Chinese. So one of the biggest challenges when you are trying to stimulate the brain to improve learning is that, you know, learning is, especially speech learning, is involving multiple areas in the brain and multiple systems, right? Here you have a list of different systems that are playing a role in speech category learning. You have sensory systems, reward, memory, control, attention. So just in the cortex, you also have different subcortical structures that are also playing a super important role, like coming from the reward system and the dopaminergic system. And most of the brain stimulation techniques and some of the stimulation techniques that are more popular are actually stimulating specific areas in the brain. That is, for example, the case of transcranial magnetic stimulation, right? You can use transcranial magnetic stimulation to stimulate a specific brain area. But as far as learning is actually the result of multiple contributions from multiple brain areas. So, you know, using transcranial magnetic stimulation to improve learning is, you will have to focus on one particular system, right? And one particular brain region, but there are many others, right? So we decided to, that's one of the reasons why we decided to, and I think one of the benefits, potential benefits of transcutaneous vagus nerve stimulation is that, you know, this brain stimulation technique is actually, instead of targeting a particular brain region in the cortex, is actually targeting a whole system that is innervating multiple brain regions. So here I'm just describing very briefly how this stimulation technique works, at least the protocol that we use. So basically what we try to do here is to try to stimulate the vagus nerve through the auricular branch by targeting the Simbai concha with electrical pulses, right? So we basically use these two electrodes, and we use this putty to place the electrodes here, and we were delivering the electrodes to the Simbai concha here in the ear, and the idea here was to target the vagus nerve here through the auricular branch, right? And this is based on previous research, this fMRI research, for example, from Frangos, but there is also some track tracing studies in cats showing that you can actually, modulate neural activity in some, in the vagus nerve just by targeting through the auricular branch, right? By targeting some studies, we use the Simbai concha. You might find other studies that are using the tragus. I can talk more about that later in the questions. And so instead of trying to target a specific brain region, by using vagus nerve, we try to send like a global and diffuse signal to multiple brain areas, some of them involved in learning, through the locus coeruleus norepinephrine system, right? So so we know that the vagus nerve is projecting into the different nuclei, and one of those nuclei is the locus coeruleus, which is, as you know, involved in the production of norepinephrine. And so the idea was to try to modulate the production of norepinephrine to modulate the degree of the state of arousal or alertness, right? Because we know from previous research that changes in arousal and alertness can be used to enhance memory and perception. Well, vagus nerve, the locus coeruleus norepinephrine system is not the only system that you can stimulate with the vagus nerve, and there is, sort of, for example, so research using animal models, and they in that case, from Michael Kilgar's lab at UT Dallas, for example, and they also target the production of acetylcholine. And I'm happy to talk about that later in the questions. But there are a few studies, actually non-invasive studies, using vagus nerve stimulation and showing that vagus nerve stimulation can actually enhance memory and auditory plasticity in multiple ways, right? And so we were thinking about using this technique to try to improve the acquisition of non-native speech sounds. And this is partially because we know that memory and auditory plasticity are playing a super important role in the acquisition of novel speech categories. Okay, I see another comment in here. So given that the vagus nerve innervates muscles in the larynx, pharynx, and the soft palates and receives somatosensory information from these same areas, yeah. I wonder if this type of stimulation would influence motor production. Okay, that's a great question, and we should talk about that in more detail in the Q&A session. I would just say that some of the collateral effects of vagus nerve stimulation might actually small changes in voice production, right? Actually, if you look at Michael Kilgar's lab using a mice model, they were able to use vagus nerve stimulation to modulate auditory plasticity, but also motor plasticity. So yeah, that's totally true. And right now you have, for example, Matthew Leonard from UCSF. I think he's now working on a non-invasive version of these effects of vagus nerve stimulation in motor systems. Yeah. So yeah, that's totally true. Yeah. Okay. So one of the very interesting things about arousal and alertness is, like, when we increase the level of arousal or alertness, we might enhance memory and or perception, but these enhancements are usually, they show a high degree of specificity, right? Or selectivity. So the enhancement is not, so those, there are different models that are trying to account for this phenomenon and other phenomena related to arousal. So one of the most popular models is the arousal bias competition model. And basically what this model observes is, like, when the level of arousal or alertness is increasing, usually the locus coeruleus norepinephrine system is biasing memory and perception, but in favor of those features that are more salient, right? So the features that are less salient, usually it's more difficult to observe enhancement for those features, right? So there is a kind of like an asymmetry that is induced by the enhancement of arousal, and there are actually, some of these models actually, they have interesting hypotheses about the mechanisms connecting nonlinear interactions between norepinephrine, but also glutamate. And I'm happy to talk about that too later if you are interested. And there is actually a very recent non-invasive VNS study, and they actually found that the VNS was enhancing the P300 in response to easier to perceive targets versus difficult to perceive targets, right? So here they found that the VNS was actually enhancing neural responses to targets that were easier to perceive versus those that were less easy to perceive, right? Or less salient. And this is important because we know that native speakers of English, when they are learning Mandarin tones, they typically tend to be better at categorizing, tones that are better described in terms of pitch height, right? So for those of you that are familiar with the Mandarin tone system, you will know that a very common description is in terms of pitch height. So you have, for example, tone 1 is high pitch, and then you have tone 3, which is usually in a lower frequency range, and also pitch direction. So for example, you have the second Mandarin tone, the low rising is direction is going up, but here you have this other tone, the tone 4, which is high falling. It has the opposite direction, right? It's a falling direction. So we know that when native speakers of English are learning Mandarin tones, they are better. It's easier for them, presumably because it's more salient, to categorize tones, the high and low tone 1 and tone 3, than the rising and falling tone. And that's something that I'm showing in here. This is actually from a data set that we have been collected over the last, 10 years. When I joined Bharat's lab, I mean, he already have a lot of data points in here, and a total of 678 learners, right? And you can see like the proportion of correct responses for tone 1 and tone 3 is always much higher than for tone 2 and tone 4. Of course, there is some individual variability, but this is something that I observed in pretty much all the studies that I conducted, and they tend to be much better at tone 1 and tone 3 than on tone 2 and tone 4. So I wanted to talk about that because okay, someone is asking, have you tried working with data sets from actually spoken Mandarin from newscasters? The smear from one phoneme to the next introduces an interesting complexity. Yeah, and there is also the neutral tone and tones, and also the shandy phenomenon. There are so many interesting phenomena that we cannot capture when we are not working with continuous speech and it would be really interesting to investigate. We can talk about that in the Q&A session if you want. Yeah, but we haven't done that. And yeah, you are right. There are different phenomena that we won't be able to investigate unless we go to broadcast and more continuous speech context. So what I was saying is, like, the reason why I talk about this is because we actually have 3 different training groups, right? So we have a control group where they didn't receive any stimulation, but we have 2 experimental groups. And the difference between the experimental groups was that we have an easy group, and in the easy group, we pair stimulation with the tones that we know that are typically easier to categorize for this population, right? Tone 1 and tone 3. But when we have another group, which was the hard group, and here we pair stimulation with the tones that we know that are typically more difficult for this population, right? So tone 2 and tone 4, right? So we were trying to see whether we were also capturing these effects of arousal, right? By, changing the tones that were being stimulated. And here you just have an example of the different TVNS pulses, and they were, because that's a technical detail that could be interesting for any of you that is working on TVNS. So this is the TVNS, the alignment that we use, right? And that was based on previous research by Michael Kilgar in a mice model. And I'm happy to talk about that. But I just want to emphasize that we didn't provide petty stimulation. So they were not receiving stimulation all the time. We just stimulate the specific targets, and those targets change depending on the condition. So here are the results. So what we found is that we found a general enhancement. So here, okay, so here what participants were trained across multiple blocks, right? And then they have a generalization block where they were listening to the same tones, but they were produced by different talkers, different speakers. And here you have, like in orange would be the easy group. So these participants receive stimulation only when they were categorizing the tones that are supposed to be easier for them, right? And here in purple, you have the hard group, right? And then in green, you have the control, right? So we observe a general enhancement, right? For the group that was receiving a stimulation in the tones that are supposed to be easier for them to categorize. And actually we have data after the experiment, showing that it was actually easier for them to categorize those tones, no matter the group, right? But we observed a high degree of specificity. We found that, especially for that group, most of the enhancement was driven by the tones that receive stimulation, right? When you look at the performance of the same group, if you look at the orange learning curve, which is the learning curve for the group that received stimulation in the easy to categorize tones, you know, they were doing well for those tones, but they were not doing as well for the tones that were more difficult. This is suggesting that the effects of stimulation, or the benefits of stimulation in here, stick to the stimuli that receive stimulation, right? And when that stimuli was the easier to categorize stimuli, that's when we found the enhancement, right? And here I just want to show the, you know, like this is a comparison between, so this is here, these are the same learning curves, but here I'm using a different scale. So here I'm just showing improvement, the percent improvement, which is giving you a perspective of how they are improving relative to the first block of training. And here I'm showing the same information, but just in raw percentage of correct responses, right? So you can have a different perspective of the same data. And here I'm also including the learning curve of the aggregate data set, which is the data set of 678 learners performing in the same paradigm that I mentioned before, right? So you can have another idea of the magnitude of the enhancement. We ran different statistics, and the only condition that was better than the aggregate data set with 600 learners was the TVNS condition that showed the enhancement. And this enhancement was equivalent to several sessions of training without TVNS, right? Like 2 or 3 sessions of training, right? So this is suggesting that you know, TVNS could be a promising technique to try to you know, improve the perceptual processing of non-native speech sounds in learners, right? Obviously, there are so many open questions that I will be happy to discuss with you, right? So this is what I'm showing here is a long-term training paradigm, right? And here we investigate just the effects of TVNS for just one training session, right? So there are many other aspects that we can investigate, right? And I just wanted to finish this you know, talk with just very few conclusions, right? So I start talking about the challenges to acquire L2 speech categories, right? And you know, but the more we learn about the systems that are involved in L2 speech acquisition is you know, is helping us to find different ways, right, to improve these L2 speech acquisition. And I was discussing two specific ways. One of those is definitely not is high availability training with feedback, which is a very classic training paradigm that you can find in the literature. And if you go back to some of the research that, for example, Bharat was doing with Ganji in Pittsburgh, you can actually specify the contributions of dopamine and the dopaminergic system to improvements induced by this type of training, right? And especially in the short term, you can see how this training is actually helping to improve the representation, the acquisition of L2 speech categories in the superior temporal gyrus, right? And also in the short term, like when you combine training with TVNS, you can boost perception, right? But it's in a highly specific way. There is a high degree of specificity, and that's something that when I had the chance to discuss this with other colleagues that were running experiments and TVNS, is something that many of them experience too, right? A high degree of specificity, right? It seems like the effects are not spread all over the, you know, there are some cases in which the effects are, enhancement is not affecting everything, right? This has a high degree of selectivity and specificity. And the other aspect that I showed today was, you know, the benefits of using also this high variability training with feedback, in the long run, it can actually be used to improve the neural representation, the neural coding of auditory signals, right? And especially in those subcortical areas within the ascending auditory pathways, right? Those here we are talking about more than early auditory processing and areas that might not be as plastic as the cortex, but they can also be changed, right? So I think we can stop here so we can have more time for discussion. As Edith mentioned before, you know, because of what is happening right now in Texas, I think that I happen to have some time to answer your questions. And but before that, I just want to emphasize that this is a result of my postdoctoral research, and this is the result of a collaboration with great scholars and researchers over the last 2 years. So I just wanted to acknowledge, you know, their mentorship and you know, friendship and contribution over the last years, and also this work was funded by several funding agencies, and we are very thankful to them too.
Thank you so much, Fernando.